Hello, Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. It is my pleasure and honor to have you on our discussion today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert.
We are in a difficult moment in the history of the church, but we are always in difficult moments. So this is not completely new. We've had the Avignon captivity of the papacy. We've had empires wash across Italy and movements in the modern period from communism to fascism, etc. We have a question from our audience. Why would you have this man on who wants to depose our Pope? I wondered if we might start with that question, Peter. Is that something that you would like to do?
Sure. Why not? Why not start with the hot topic of the day? So Pope Francis has shown himself to be a reckless and damaging ruler of the church for the past 11 years. If you want to see the evidence for that in the doctrinal and moral categories, then you just need to read the statement that was released on the Feast of St. Athanasius, May 2nd, last week, that the call for the resignation of Pope Francis. This is not an isolated document. This is the seventh major document that has appeared in this 11-year period, and it's been an escalating sequence. A letter addressed to the Pope at the beginning, very respectfully asking him to clarify things, then a letter addressed to the cardinals, then a letter addressed to the bishops, and so forth. I'm not going to give the whole history of these statements, but the fact of the matter is that there is damning evidence against this Pope, and it's important for us not to sweep it under the carpet because of some kind of misplaced sense of allegiance to the great leader. We respect his office, we respect the papacy, but even Peter was corrected by Paul, and throughout history, there have been examples of popes who have gravely misstepped, and they have been corrected for it, either contemporaneously or posthumously. So I don't know when Pope Francis is going to be corrected, if it's going to be during his life or after his death, but I am 100% convinced that there will be a major course correction in the Catholic Church away from the policies and the principles embodied in Pope Francis, back towards something more traditional. I'm not too optimistic about how quickly this process will take place, but it will take place.
Well, I must say that every Catholic has a hesitation to speak badly of the Pope. There's something inside the faith itself which wishes to honor the successor of Peter, and which is hoping that in every way possible there could be unity in the church, led by a man who is in harmony with the will of Christ, the will of God, and who leads us in that direction. So what are your main concerns about how the Pope has led the church?
Well, there are really quite a lot of them, but I mean there is a serious confusion in the realm of moral theology. The departures from Veritatis Splendor are obvious. One could mention Amoris Laetitia. One could mention more recently Fiducia Supplicans. There are very grave departures from the constant, uninterrupted teaching of the magisterium of the Church on intrinsically evil acts and the whole structure of virtues and commandments, really. So these are not subtle technical details. These are bread and butter Catholicism 101 detail issues. That's just in the moral sphere. In the sphere of liturgy, there is a perpetuation of this rupture with the bimillennial tradition of the church. And again, anyone who studies the history of the liturgy can see that rupture has occurred on many levels and in many respects, right? This is not a minor matter for a religion such as ours, which prizes the notion of tradition, paradosis, handing on what has been received, right?
Yes.
The question of the death penalty is another one. I mean, the Francis's teaching on the death penalty is a pure and simple rupture, even with John Paul II's views, which were already anti-death penalty, right? Much less with all the preceding popes and councils.
Well, on the death penalty, I must say it's a difficult question to argue in favor of execution and death in any case, when you always will hope for some type of imprisonment or penalty which could cause conversion. So the moment it is said, of course, that someone can, as he approaches death, knowing he must be executed, can still convert, and that's been said many times. So that,
Right.
but we also recognize that in our turbulent world, there are so many cases when justice can go astray and go awry, and forces manipulate evidence, and people can be condemned to death in a process that we might imagine in some cases would be legitimate, be a legitimate punishment. But there's so
Well,
many mistakes. I think this in some ways is a practical call to avoid the judgment so that no miscarriage of justice could occur. But I do.
yeah, but I think on this point I want to push back a bit because first of all, it's by no means apparent to me that it's more merciful to lock somebody into a jail cell for decades and decades,
Mm,
along with other people who are many of whom are dangerous. And there've been whole books written about how dangerous prison life is and
yeah,
how violent it can be, and how there are sodomites and who rape. And I mean, all this there's such horrible stuff that happens in prisons that we should not consider it to be automatically more merciful to condemn somebody to decades of that kind of existence. And secondly, as you pointed out, there are many cases where the prospect of imminent death has been exactly the catalyst for the conversion of somebody. Do you want to see a priest? Maybe somebody wants to see a priest if they know they're going to die tomorrow, right?
yeah,
So I mean, I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of conversion in the face of death. Of known death as opposed to unknown death, which is the case for most of us. And the last point is the death penalty, precisely because it is a prudential call, depending upon the common good, the judgment of the ruler of a society for the common good and the safety of his citizens. It can't be something that the Pope is authorized to dictate to all the secular rulers of the world. But that's exactly what this Pope is trying to do. He's
yeah.
trying to say the death penalty is always and everywhere wrong and should always be eliminated. There's not even a Pope in the Middle Ages who ever dared to rule so heavy-handedly over the entire sphere of political authorities in the world. It's actually incredible when you think about it.
Yeah.
So
Well, what you are saying is that you're afraid that there's been a change in church teaching on this particular point, but you really think it extends to other points of morality. You're focusing on this point because it's the one very specific point where a change has been asked to be made in the catechism itself, which is a rather rare thing. But people in Rome are saying we've done this before on other matters with regard
mhm.
to human affairs like slavery. We used to
Yeah, but
say,
see, this is also quite false because nowadays there's this tendency to talk about development of doctrine as
yes,
if any doctrine can develop into anything else. I call it's like pulling a rabbit out of a hat or pulling a dove out of a mitre.
mm,
That is to say, you can't go from X to non-X. That's a contradiction. If the church actually taught X and taught it in a serious and solemn and prolonged way, the church can't develop that into non-X or
yeah,
anti-X. That's not possible. The church has never been in favor of indentured servitude or chattel slavery. I mean, the church has tolerated it for sure. As I mean, it's existed in almost every society, and unfortunately, it's coming back in the modern world in various places. The church has tolerated that as an evil to be eventually phased out. But the church has never said that the death penalty is an intrinsic evil, the way the church has said that abortion is an intrinsic evil, right? So I think we just need to be clear about these things and not necessarily adopt the line that's been that's being put out
yeah.
by
Well,
the
well,
spokesman.
well, the very first point that we want to make is that you have a concern that tradition will not be maintained and new and innovative, modernistic, and secularizing elements will enter into church teaching, and we will lose the purity of the faith, of the deposit of the faith. And that's a
Exactly.
legitimate concern. All throughout history, there have been condemnations of heresies. And
Mhm.
those are innovations. Those are changes in church teaching that are going too far, mistakes, not handing over the pure doctrine that was really from Christ himself and handed on by the apostles. but so I know that that's what you're concerned about, and there are others who want to push this envelope. And if we think that they're in good faith, they want to develop doctrine in the same way that they feel it has been developed on social issues like abortion, like slavery, etc. They want to try to develop doctrine, and there's a tremendous debate, and we can't resolve that here. I do think there needs to be a recognition that as the doctrine develops and sort of comes into deeper understanding or new conditions of new technologies, etc., we need thoughtful people who love tradition to be part of the discussion.
Mhm.
And therefore, we shouldn't say it's a simple question. And we should say that the points you're raising, even on this very emotional question of the death penalty, should be heard and listened to. And there should be a
Mhm.
weighing of these things to see whether we're departing from our received tradition in an illegitimate way. I agree with you
Mhm.
on that.
Mhm. Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
and and I think that's why most people concerned about this see it as that sort of foot in the door, where
Mhm.
if you get an agreement, you can change this thing, which people
Yes.
they don't want to see people executed, so they're hesitant to say we must retain the death penalty. But if there's a tradition that there's some way this can be justified, it has to be a part
Let
of our
me
teaching.
let me put it this way, Robert. There's as much of a reason to change to there is no more basis for saying that the teaching on contraception or on homosexuality is unchangeable than there is for saying that the teaching on the death penalty is unchangeable. That is to say, if you look at somebody like Edward Fazer's work on the death penalty, he and Joseph Bissett wrote a very important book called "By Man Shall His Blood Be Shed," which goes through the whole history of the scriptures, the patristics, the scholastics, the magisterial documents, and shows that there is a consistent teaching that the death penalty is in principle legitimate, whether it's prudentially wise or not. He demonstrates that it's not even really, there's not even a question mark about that. So if you overturn that and you say not just that it's imprudent, but that it's contrary to the gospel, contrary to human dignity, I mean, this very strong language that has been used in the Francis pontificate,
Yeah.
then you are opening the door right away to overturning Humanae Vitae, to overturning the teaching on homosexuality, and in fact, Tuco Fernandez, and I call him Tuco because that's what all his friends call him. He's not embarrassed of that nickname. Cardinal Fernandez said at a recent press conference, we need to reformulate what the Catechism says about homosexuality, about intrinsically disordered acts. Right? This is where they're heading. They want to head this in this
Yeah.
direction.
Yeah.
And the nose, the camel's nose in the tent
Yes.
is the death penalty change, because as you said, everybody's sympathetic to amnesty for criminals and so forth, right? It's an easy place to change doctrine,
Yeah.
right? And then you've got people hooked. Let me just make one last point. It's a problem that if you look at hundreds of catechisms published over the past 500 years, and there are hundreds of catechisms, most people have only ever heard of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, but every diocese in the world practically had its own catechism. And Sophia Institute Press has been publishing beautiful new hardcover editions of these classic historical catechisms called Tradivox. That's the series title. And you can see from the 16th century, or from the 13th century, in fact, 16th, 18th, 19th, whatever century, whatever country, they all teach the same Catholic faith, including the legitimacy of the death penalty. Now, it's a problem if suddenly we're saying something different from that whole witness to the universal ordinary magisterium of the church, right?
Yeah.
That's why it's not somehow extremists, like, people sometimes think, oh, you're such an extremist. I mean, no, we so-called traditionalists are just pointing to this huge body of pre-existing doctrine
Yeah.
and practice and saying, what exactly was wrong with that? Why do we need to chuck it out the window? No, that's not the way Catholics think or behave.
Yeah. I mean, there's a problem here with the two words, traditionalist Catholic and
Mm,
simply Roman Catholic.
mm,
What you just described was very familiar to my father and his brother, my uncle, who was a Franciscan priest. It was the church's teaching which is a guide for humanity on this toward the narrow way to follow in this world, which is filled with dangers, in order to finally accomplish an arrival at a safe space, which is safe is the same word as salvation,
Hmm.
to no longer be pounded by the passions and vices of this world. And
Hmm.
all of the teaching of the church was ordered in this way, and it wasn't in question. It was a single mosaic or tapestry of
Hmm.
teachings, and it was connected to the teaching of Christ himself, and had not been changed or altered, even though in some places it had been developed. And what you're saying is, in the past couple hundred years, there's something we call modernism, which has many aspects in liturgy and in morality and even in ecclesiology
Hmm.
and ultimately in theology and certainly in scripture study. All across the board, thoughtful Catholics are being challenged as insufficiently modernizing by the spirit of the world, we might call it. And we shouldn't call ourselves, if you're traditional and want to keep the tradition and be faithful to the tradition, you should simply be called Catholic.
Hmm.
That's the way it always was. In a way, it's an admission that there's a type of Catholic who isn't traditionalist to claim the name of a traditionalist group. No, we are simply Catholic. Eh,
Well, let me throw in a thought there. I mean, I agree with you. I agree with you in theory, right? If we understand what Catholic means, it means universal, not just in space, that it encompasses all, nations and peoples and tribes and tongues at this
Yes,
moment, but also Catholic in that it extends to all ages of the church. It's as Saint Vincent of Lerins says, it's what has been held
yes,
always, everywhere, and by everyone, right?
yes,
That's what Catholic means. However, we should just point out that the word Christian by itself should be enough. If we say Christian, we should mean those who follow Christ and who belong to the church he founded. So Catholic really is superfluous. But we have to say Catholic Christian because there are unfortunately heretics and schismatics who are not part of the Catholic Church. And so we say Catholic Christian, and we even have to be a little more specific and say Roman Catholic Christian to signify our adherence to the throne of Peter, because, as you know, some Anglicans call themselves Catholics as well, right? And so they may call themselves Anglo-Catholics, but the point is that they've sort of adopted that term. So now we're with Roman Catholic Christian, right? So I guess my point is that to put the word traditional in there is simply to recognize the unfortunate fact that there are all too many Catholics who don't care about continuity with tradition and who are actually opposed to it.
well, yeah, that's a sad reality. Uh,
Mm.
I do think that Jesus, when he was teaching, said that there will be persecutions of this teaching, but it is the teaching that leads to life. The disciples stayed with him, followed him. Their hopes in many ways were dashed at his crucifixion, and they were trembled, and some denied him, including Peter. But the essence of this institution of the church, which grew up over time, is that it is a kind of a ship in a kind of turbulent sea of the world, which carries a message which has been handed down for 2,000 years. And that message is really the actions and the individuals preaching, healing, and then sacrificial suffering and death of one man who
Mhm.
was also God, the God man, Jesus Christ. And this fact at the center of history, now getting further and further in the rearview mirror, was carried on over 2,000 years, 20 centuries. And in the news of his acts, his teachings, his sacrificial death, the memory of that, the celebration of that, the representing of that, the making present again of that is the liturgical aspect of this community. And
Mhm.
the doctrinal and moral teaching of the church is a result of telling again today what he told the people of his time. And this is what the church is. The church is the continuation of Christ's mystery, Christ's life and the and ministry in 2,000 years later.
Yes, and in fact, what you're saying, it's beautifully appropriate for today's feast. Today is the Ascension of the Lord.
Yes.
40 days after Easter. I don't buy this garbage about Ascension Sunday. That doesn't make any sense. So today's 40 days after Easter. It's the feast of the Ascension. It will be celebrated as such in a few dioceses throughout the world that still retain the traditional, we should say, biblical date of Ascension, but also by all of the communities that celebrate the ancient Roman rite, such as the Fraternity of St. Peter Parish that I attend. But I think the Ascension is such an important and neglected mystery in the life of our Lord. We have to remember, what you were saying earlier about the harbor of salvation and escaping the tumult and passions of the world and so forth. I mean, that's salvation. That's heaven. We want to be perfectly blissfully happy with the Lord. And that's what the Ascension reminds us of. As St. Paul says, don't dwell on the things of earth. Put your mind on the things of heaven. Unfortunately, we have a lot of earthly business we have to deal with, so we can't always be, like the contemplative religious putting their minds on heaven. But there's this ascensional dynamism to the Christian faith, where our Lord, who is true God and true man, he also unites in himself earth and heaven. And so he comes into the world, but he also leaves the world, in a sense, not completely leaving us behind, but he leaves it to return with his humanity, his glorified humanity, to the Father. And that is that's a lesson. That's an icon, really, that the church should always be teaching people to look beyond merely earthly and worldly considerations, beyond ecology, beyond environmentalism, beyond climate change, beyond immigration, to heaven, to the eternal realities, the eternal truths that save mankind and that are the only source of peace in this world, our adherence to these mysteries and truths.
Well, thank you, Peter. That's an eloquent appeal for us to retain a type of evangelical character, even as human history provides us with challenges that weren't present at the time the gospel was preached, like artificial intelligence, like human gene therapy taken as vaccination, like calls on us to act in different ways with regard to environmental concerns, and that could, in some cases, impoverish us for a time. But I certainly think that your description of that, looking beyond while at the same time living in this world, is a clarion call to remain faithful to the faith once handed down. But the very fact that we live in time and that we pass through periods in human and in church history suggests that we have to prepare in a very special way in each generation to confront whatever may come, whether it be the rise of the Nazi Party or the rise of communism and gulags in the Soviet Union, where people were imprisoned and executed for baptizing and carrying on the faith, and in our modern Western world, all sorts of challenges to traditional faith. And in my perspective, we've got to hold together as best we can and even appeal to those forces outside of the Catholic Church, to the Orthodox, and I think we're very close to the Orthodox. Our sacraments are commonly accepted by each other, and even to the evangelical Protestants. I think they're deeply in love with Jesus, and there's a lot that we could work on together. And I long for a kind of ecumenism that's real and based on tradition. And it's breaking my heart to see that inside the Catholic Church, we are being separated and drawn apart greater and greater, almost in political categories, left and right, progressive and conservative. Whereas I certainly have a great concern for the poor and for the oppressed. I consider myself, in a sense, a liberal in the classic terms, but liberals are no longer liberals, I don't think, either.
Well,
But,
yeah. Oh, sorry. May I make a point about what you're saying?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, what you're talking about really is just the Catholic ideal of of a saint, the Catholic idea of a saint, I shouldn't say ideal, is one who holds together, who holds it all together, right? Who is oriented towards heaven and the things of God, who puts prayer first over activism, but who is also sensitive to the needs of his brothers and sisters, who has his eyes open, who can see the dangers, the temptations, the difficulties, the needs of his time, and can respond to them. I mean, obviously, different people with different vocations are going to do this in different ways. But I'm just thinking about somebody like Pier Giorgio Frassati, one of my favorite saints, whose canonization has just been announced for 2025. I think this is wonderful news because Pier Giorgio Frassati was an exemplary, and I'm going to use the word traditional Catholic. That is, he went to his daily Tridentine Mass, he prayed the Rosary, he was very pious, but he cared for the poor. He gave his money to the poor, often to great expense and inconvenience to himself. He was an outdoorsman. He was somebody who engaged in fist fights against the fascists. I mean, he was not some kind of pansy, some kind of wallflower saint, on in a painting. No, he was a very flesh and blood, manly man. He smoked a pipe. Okay, this is, in my opinion, his canonization is wonderful because it is showing us what a fully integrated Christian should look like. And he's not a progressive, and he's not a traditionalist. He's just a solid Catholic in every way, right? That's what we need.
Okay, I think that's a beautiful reference to Frassati, and I think then we have to look at these recent leaders of the church and see how we got to this impasse now, where we have the Lefebvrists in schism or half in schism, or no longer in schism but not really accepted. First, let's talk about that for one moment. What is that situation?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I just want to make a simple point about Lefebvre himself. Archbishop Lefebvre, in the middle of the 1970s, famously said, "I am being persecuted today and marginalized for teaching the same things that all the French bishops were teaching 10 years ago."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is a dramatic example of the kind of shift that we're talking about, right? He said, "I'm not the one who has changed. Everybody else has changed." And by the way, Ratzinger said the same thing. Ratzinger
Yes.
said, "Everyone calls me, some kind of stick in the mud, traditionalist." But he said, I still hold the same thing that I've always held as everybody else who's gone bonkers. And of course, he didn't put it that way. That's
Well,
um,
mhm.
but so Lefebvre himself was a model of fidelity to what he had received, and
Okay, but what was the
hold on, we'll get there. That was his Episcopal motto is, well, actually his Episcopal motto was something else, but his slogan in a sense was, "I am passing on that which I have received," which of course is the words of St. Paul. So what happened there, of course, is a tragedy, because Paul VI was deeply antagonistic to Lefebvre, very unsympathetic, felt threatened by him, wouldn't treat him respectfully, wouldn't treat him fairly or justly, accused him of all sorts of things that he never did. I mean, this is all well documented. And so Lefebvre really was persecuted. There's no question about it. He was not a self-made martyr. He was a persecuted man in the church in the 70s and into the 80s. And the tragedy is that there wasn't somebody like Joseph Ratzinger on hand from the beginning to try to broker an understanding, to try to make room. Well, really just to understand what Lefebvre was saying. Nobody wanted to listen to this voice crying out.
we, yeah, we have to explain then why that happened.
Mhm.
Why
Well,
why was there these two trends? This trend that Lefebvre saw a need to preserve the tradition that all the French bishops and all the Catholic bishops of the world had been teaching, but became only he himself with a few sympathizers. And Pope Paul VI took the rest of the bishops and went ahead with the conciliar, post-conciliar teaching and said, we have a different way of presenting and carrying out these teachings, which we We assert that we still share, but you're carrying them out in a narrow way, and we're opening up, into the world.
Sure, that's what they would say. Of course, the question is that really true? I mean, for one thing, Paul VI is notorious for having departed from Vatican II on a number of points, because his own sympathies really were not at all with the. I mean, apart from obviously there are exceptions like Humanae Vitae, where he held the line of tradition, Mysterium Fidei, where he re-emphasized transubstantiation and the real presence. I mean, I'm not saying that there were no traditional aspects to Paul VI's faith, but if you read his life, I mean, Yves Chiron wrote a wonderful biography of Paul VI, very fair, very objective, but he just points out he was kind of a liberal Catholic in his own day. That is somebody who was on the modern trend side of everything. We have to put the liturgy in the vernacular. We have to simplify things. We have to, we have to have a rapprochement with communists and socialists. This was the kind of attitude he had. And I'm sorry, but I think that those attitudes can be critiqued, and they were critiqued by people at the time, not just in retrospect.
Okay, here's a question. I agree that there's been a massive challenge in my lifetime and your lifetime, to the accurate, and this is also what Joseph Ratzinger said, Pope Benedict XVI, whom I knew and spoke with on a number of occasions, 30 or 40 occasions. And you pointed out that he said as he slowly got older, he started to be regarded as more conservative, even though nothing really changed in his thinking. It's just that the more progressive elements went further and further and further in their direction. And so they started to regard Pope Benedict as conservative. But he didn't change. And so somehow this has happened in our lifetime. And yet, as my father always said to me, the pre-Vatican II church had some elements that required, or at least seemed to require, a certain aggiornamento, and that we tried to make that updating or modernization, you might call it, even to the point of use of Latin as one example. So many people loved Latin and they knew it in the liturgy, but they had difficulty using it because they didn't know it well enough. And so they went, in a sense, inevitably toward the vernacular. Nevertheless, it didn't require the absolute elimination of Latin. But the church had a difficult time staying abreast of modern society when it seemed to focus, in a sense, backwards on preserving these texts and these arguments and these various forms of doing theology and doing scriptural exegesis. So they tried to keep up with the modern world, and they got into this terrific tornado, we might call it, the post-conciliar tornado, which is torn it all apart. So what's needed today, I think, is probably another 50 years to pick up the damage here and there of the shattered churches and shattered communities and shattered parishes. And like post-tornado, you start to rebuild. And we need, but in this process, though, back to the question of the leadership of the papacy, if we diminish one pope, we diminish all popes, I think. I'm worried that calls could have come out, and probably did come out, if you recall, when Paul VI defined in Humanae Vitae the church's teaching on contraception. There were immediately huge protests, hundreds of theologians who said, he's wrong, the Pope is wrong. And from that moment, we've had a kind of disregard for the authority of the Pope back to that teaching. And if we have disregard for what Pope Francis is saying, then we may have a kind of Protestant attitude towards the overthrowing of the hierarchical structure, and end up with dozens of small churches, the church of Peter Kwasniewski, the church of Archbishop Lefebvre, or etc. We would lose this sense of Catholicity that we've got probably as much as anything else we must hold on to somehow.
Mhm. Yeah, I think some of what you're saying certainly is true, but there are some problems with other aspects of what you're saying. Martin Luther was somebody who rebelled against the tradition of the church. He rebelled against Catholic theology, and that included the papacy for him. The traditionalists today who are objecting to Pope Francis or on a number of issues are doing so precisely in the name of adhering to the Catholic teaching, the magisterial and traditional teaching of the church. It's exactly the opposite of the Protestant. It is as perfectly anti-Protestant as you can get. And I think a sign of that is that Pope Francis himself has frequently spoken positively of Luther. So the one who's more Protestant in this case is up for grabs, I would say. But in terms of aggiornamento, right? There's a famous saying: "He who marries the spirit of the age today is a widow tomorrow." Right? Uh, so the aggiornamento, I mean, the church was flourishing in so many ways before the Second Vatican Council. I'm not denying there were challenges. I'm not denying there were problems. There always are, as you said before about church history. But there was a flourishing of intellectual and cultural life all throughout the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s that was going on. I mean, in the arts, in literature, in theology. I know it. I've got a library full of this stuff, right? Yeah. And there's nothing like it after Vatican II until only quite recently, when there's finally been a kind of renaissance and resurgence precisely on the part of people who are not wedded to this ill-conceived aggiornamento of the council. That's where the renewal is happening right now. That's where you have fresh art, fresh ideas, coming up.
I'm gonna make a polemical remark.
Sure.
The Father Arrupe was a Spanish Jesuit who was in Hiroshima as a missionary to Japan in 1945 when the city was bombed, August 6, 1945. And 70,000 or 90,000 people died almost immediately in what we might consider an inferno of flame and radiation. The only time, except for the 9th in Nagasaki, that the atomic bomb has been used, which was the product of the greatest scientific research project over 4 or 5 years, the Manhattan Project, spending billions of dollars. In modern terms, it would be tens of billions. They turned the entire United States into one factory to get the processed uranium and prepare it. And Hitler, having been told that they were doing this, said that they'll never achieve it because they don't have the ability to do what we can't do in Germany. And one of his advisors or supporters later said, "We had no concept that the entire United States of America would be turned into one huge factory to build the bomb." Arrupe later became the head of the Jesuit order. And it was his leadership of the order the Jesuits are in some way the avant-garde or the Marine Corps in some way of the Catholic Church. And they're often very learned men and men very committed. And they took a direction in following up on Vatican II and carrying it forward that saw essentially, it was in the prospect or the concept of Arrupe's vision of Hiroshima being destroyed that day. He saw it. In the next days, he went and washed people's burning faces. So I say that there's a root of the Second Vatican Council and of the shift in the Jesuit order towards social and earthly concerns that's rooted in that experience of Arrupe in 1945. I say the Hiroshima bomb and the destruction of human life in a horrifying way showed that the modern experiment in a kind of often Christian society up until the 1700s and still in the 1800s and into the 1900s, a Christian society with a Christian ethos had led to a type of horrifying end. And the Jesuits wanted to engage the world and be in the world in such a way as to prevent this from being the future of humanity. And they took this as the signs of the times. And I don't know how to carry this thought forward except to say that Pope Francis is a Jesuit, the first Jesuit pope we've ever had. Pope Ratzinger resigned his papacy for all sorts of reasons. He felt he wasn't strong enough. But in the last years of his papacy, he was being contradicted and accused and vilified throughout the church. So Francis has given us 11 years of this Francis pontificate. I guess the conclusion I wanted to make is, in the context of Hiroshima, of tens of thousands of people burning in a couple of hours, in the concept of a church facing a world with sort of semi-divine powers, now with artificial intelligence on the horizon, my great concern is that we stay together. But I don't know how we can do it. I would love to have tradition restored, fully embraced, and I would love to have the Jesuits reconverted back to an understanding of that tradition and how it can face this 21st century, which looks to be providing new challenges, unprecedented challenges, and very dangerous challenges to human dignity that really have no precedent at all. And that's why I'm doing these podcasts.
I agree. I mean, everything. I mean, I agree with almost everything you're saying there. I do see World War II as a fundamental turning point in the mentality of the Catholic leadership and the Catholic intelligentsia. There's a big shift that occurs, and it's after World War II that you have, for example, just to take one very important example, there is a sudden acceleration of liturgical change and so-called reform that comes after World War II. The challenging thing is this. It sometimes seems as if maybe the Catholic Church, okay, so some people have said the Catholic Church was so intransigently anti-modern for such a long time, really from the Enlightenment period onwards, or even perhaps earlier in the Baroque period, that the church positioned itself so often against modern philosophy and the developments that were taking place, that these people would say that the church had sort of pent up hundreds of years of pent up energy to release in terms of finally engaging with modernity instead of just condemning it. Okay, this is the standard narrative, I would say. But it seems to me that the church during and after the Second Vatican Council sort of caught up with modernity very much on the tail end when things were already beginning to shift in a different direction. What I mean by that is a lot of the ideas in the Second Vatican Council kind of read like Enlightenment ideas, like the Synod of Pistoia from the 18th century. So they read like early modern ideas as if like, oh, we're just waking up to these things and we're going to talk about them now, when there's already a pivot taking place towards nihilism and existentialism and, what would be called postmodernism. So that by the time this aggiornamento is over, it turns out that the church updated herself to something that no longer exists. That is, to some form of modernity that is already being surpassed. And that's definitely the case today in 2024. The modernity that we're dealing with, for all the reasons you said, is quite a bit different from what the 1960s or the 1940s were experiencing. And that's where I think, this widely commented on return of tradition in liturgy, in theology, it's been commented on even by there was a big article recently in the newspapers, right? Was it Associated Press? I forget. But I mean, it's been talked about all over the place. It's an interesting article. This widely commented on phenomenon of the return to tradition on the part of younger generations is, I think, part of our intuitive or instinctive reaction to post-modernity, to the anarchical intellectual and cultural situation, which has no center, no axis, no focus, right? We need a sense of coherence and a sense of depth and of beauty, right? These things that the tradition has and can give to us. That's what we need most. I think even in a way more than unity, but by which I mean unity will come when you have the good and the true and the beautiful. That's what we need to unite around. We don't need uniformity, for its own sake, right?
Well, I think you made many good points, and we're kind of struggling to get to the final center of this. I think if we look at the creed, it says one. I believe in one holy, Catholic, and apostolic church. Now, when you say apostolic, you mean it is in keeping with what the apostles taught. That's tradition. You can't be legitimately a Christian church and not be apostolic,
Mhm.
according to the creed. We must be in touch with what Jesus taught and what the disciples told us that he taught, as he left it to them on this day of Ascension. He left it to them. And this 2,000 years has been in the hands of the followers of Christ, hopefully guided by the Holy Spirit, and being this ship, this bark in the world. We call it the bark of Peter because Peter leads it. And one holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Catholic means universal. You rightly said it means universal spatially. Every country, every city, every ethnic group in the world can be part of the universal, the Catholic Church. But you rightly said it's over time as well. We can't be part of a church that changes something so greatly that someone like St. Ignatius of Loyola or St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Francis of Assisi or Augustine would no longer recognize us as Catholic. That's part of our Catholicity. One holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Holy means we have to hold to the holiness of God and to the moral teachings. We must also, the old liturgy was so distinguished by the Confiteor at the beginning. It's a kind of principle maxima of the church that every man is a sinner, has committed sins, has put himself first, has been selfish, has been arrogant, has been proud. And this is to become holy is only to receive the grace of holiness after forgiveness, after repentance. And the church cannot change its teaching and say we now embrace everything that's unholy. We must still seek and be holy. But that's not something that we can bring ourselves. Well, we
Yes.
can only bring the longing for it.
Yes.
One. The first word, though, is one. One. Holy, Catholic, and apostolic. This is what we are supposed to be. Now we do have a remark here in the chat board by Joseph Chilo. Unity in apostasy is not the answer. Oh, and then the other one, that's another one. It's a good one too. If you follow Arupe, you believe it is okay to defy the Pope at the time John Paul II. That's absolutely true. Arupe was actually set aside by John Paul II, and he had a Jesuit at the rector of the Gregorian University, former rector, became the acting head of the Jesuits in the early 1980s, and everyone was shocked that John Paul had interfered with the life of the Jesuit order. And yes.
Well, I mean, Robert, you only brought up Arupe as a sociological explanation for the direction that the church went, and you weren't praising him. You weren't saying, therefore he was right. You were just saying he was a big part of the explanation of what happened. And I think you're absolutely right. The Jesuits have been hugely influential in terms of shaping modern Catholicism. And I think you can see, with a figure like Father James Martin, you can sort of see where that whole trajectory goes to.
And we'll deal with 2 points and then we'll probably have to be ending. It's sad to have to stop because we barely touched the beginning. The 2 points are on the morality, which is the defense really of holiness. The traditional teaching of the church, we must deny ourselves and conform ourselves to Christ. And the more we do that, the closer we come to holiness. Now, in the Catechism, we're speaking of sexual morality, and there's difficulties with sexual morality that Jesus emphasized to everyone, including to his disciples when he said, even someone who looks upon a woman with lust in his heart has already committed adultery. So the measurement of this holiness is a very high one. It always was throughout our history, but we've now had a shift really that's partly related to the sexual revolution of the 1960s that seems to want to change this teaching. And James Martin has said quite specifically on the concept of homosexuality. The Catechism says it's intrinsically disordered because men and women were meant to be sexually united for procreation. And James Martin says we know that this is not entirely true, and there's a change in our understanding, and therefore the two words have to change from intrinsically disordered to differently ordered.
Oof.
He's no,
Sorry.
this, yeah.
That's absurd. Yeah, that's a great. By the way, that's a great example of a non-development of doctrine, right? That's
Okay.
just the opposite. Yeah.
And so right there is, you are correct in saying that there's a great desire to have that catechetical change made, and that change should not be made, but that's what is desired. And many different steps are being taken in recent years to prepare us for such a step. And that's what you were really arguing about, the death penalty. Change in the teaching there was to prepare us for another type of change in this matter. And then on the question of the liturgy, which you are an expert in the liturgy, you've written beautifully about it. I myself was an altar boy with the old liturgy when it wasn't called the extraordinary form, but just Sunday Mass. So I remember a time when it wasn't this objective, iconic liturgy, but just the parish liturgy of St. Leo's or St. Patrick's or St. Anne's Church. And people would come and be very silent and think that they were drawing very close to God. And there is a kind of horizontalization of the liturgy that occurred, and it was intentionally so. But the question that someone has in the chat is there something actually wrong with the new liturgy? And is it actually in any way illegitimate, in the sense that the changes made were so great that there's a problem with the validity of the consecration? Someone asked that on the chat.
Sure. So no problem, no question about validity. There's practically nobody who denies the validity of the Novus Ordo, even among the so-called rad trads. The problems that we have with it, you have to distinguish four things. I'll be very brief here, but this is an important set of distinctions. There's validity, that's whether a sacrament happens or not. There's licitness, that is whether it's being done legally in accordance with all of the appropriate laws and rubrics. Third, there's fittingness, whether something is being done beautifully in a fitting way, right? And then fourth, there's authenticity or legitimacy, which means, is it being done in a way that's in continuity with the tradition of the church? Now, the reason I distinguish those four things is that they're each talking about a different aspect of the liturgy. They should all be present, all four of them, but they're not always all four present. Some of them can be present, some of them can be absent. So the reason I bring that up is that the essence of the liturgical debate that's going on in the Catholic Church is about the question of what does organic development of the liturgy look like over time. We know that the liturgy changes. In East and in West, the liturgy has evolved over time. It's developed. That's just a fact. It's a historical fact. But it tends to develop in certain ways and in certain directions and not others. And when there are huge changes that look like ruptures, then it seems like you have a different kind of situation on your hands. And that's exactly the problem that we've had in the past 60 years in the Catholic Church. So I'll mention this. This is a book of mine called The Once and Future Roman Rite. This is a pretty exhaustive treatment of this question of what are the differences between the Roman Rite, the classical Roman Rite, and the modern Rite of Paul VI. I go very deeply into that question in this book. I should also mention briefly this one. It's called Illusions of Reform. And it's just a set of essays about really all of the justifications that were given for making certain changes and how they're actually historically unfounded. Like, just to take one example, versus populum, the idea that having the priest facing the people was somehow more in keeping with the ancient church or the original Last Supper or something like that, which is all simply factually false. That's not the way that the Last Supper was done. The Last Supper was a reclining Jewish style meal. It was neither towards the people nor ad orientem. It was just its own thing. the early Christians themselves worshipped ad orientem. They were very, very committed to that explicitly, and we read about it in the Church Fathers. You can read about it in this book too. It's called Altar and Church by Stefan Heide, an art historian, an archaeologist. Very important book that just came out from Catholic University of America Press. So I think when you look into these questions, you realize with Ratzinger, with Benedict XVI, there has been rupture. I mean, we can debate about the depth of the rupture, but there has been rupture, and there needs to be healing. There needs to be healing.
What do you mean with Ratzinger? There has been rupture. What are you saying again?
Ratzinger knew that there had been rupture in the liturgy, that there had been a break. He talked about it in different ways. Sometimes he downplayed the break, and other times he spoke about it quite frankly. And I think that was just a kind of reflection of who he was talking to and what his aims were in the particular case. But he knew that there was a problem and that there needed to be a healing and a bridging, and that's why he issued Summorum Pontificum. It was meant as a peace-bringing operation, right? He wanted there to be a pax liturgica, where everybody in the church could worship according to the use or the rite that he wished, as long as everybody did it correctly, rubrically, beautifully. He was. I'm not saying that his idea was absolutely unobjectionable or that you couldn't poke holes in this idea, but that was his motivation. It was a beautiful, noble motivation of a Christian gentleman who wanted to see people get along with each other. And I think from my life experience that there was a lot of peace that was developing in many places because of Summorum Pontificum. Catholics were becoming accustomed to having the old liturgy as an option. And it was also having a kind of knock-on effect on the way that priests were celebrating the new liturgy. They were beginning to wear better vestments and face eastwards and give communion to people on the tongue, while kneeling. And, all these things were happening in a sort of natural, slow, and peaceful manner. And that's exactly what infuriated the people I call the aging Vatican II hippies, right? The people who really embraced the rupture, who wanted the new liturgy to be as different as possible from the old one. Oh, they were mad as hens that suddenly the new liturgy was being celebrated in a way that looked Tridentine to them, right? So, and this explains why we have the wars. There's a very easy explanation for why we're having these battles, and it largely has to do with the theological and spiritual differences of certain generations and their relationship to the Second Vatican Council. That's very
okay. Clear. Is there any way forward? We do know the Eastern Rite is the Byzantine Rite is similar in its dignity and in its mystery to the old Latin Rite. They still use Greek and in Greek Orthodoxy. And is there a way to imagine a solution after the interventions of Pope Francis to repress the old rite?
Yes. I think that I personally am rather optimistic that Traditionalist Custodes is going to be overturned. I don't know how long that's going to take, but I think it's an inevitability because it is premised on a series of falsehoods. I've written about that where there's just a number of falsehoods in there. Falsehoods cannot last in the Catholic Church. They will eventually be exposed as what they are, and the truth will replace them. So it's premised on a bunch of falsehoods. And it's an extremely, how shall I put it? It's a difficult document to implement because it forces bishops to go to war with some of the most articulate and zealous and faithful Catholics. Do they want that? They absolutely do not want that, especially if they want the church to survive, right? No, but which is a serious question here.
Your point about the basis for that document by Pope Francis being on certain things that were false or told to him also would allow him a type of out. If he was told that the old liturgy was creating a kind of fanatic little circle of elitist Catholics, you could understand why he might have wished to stop that. If
Well,
if
sure.
if you if you knew that he was told that falsely,
Mhm.
then you would say he could easily himself, say, "Gee, I was misinformed. I can make a change."
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole separate question, which we don't have time for, is how much Francis is invested in this project versus how much he's just been influenced by others.
Right.
But I would only say that the kind of falses I had in mind were not only those, but also his claim that the Novus Ordo represents a faithful fulfillment of the Second Vatican Council. That's false. His claim that the Novus Ordo contains most of the traditional liturgy. That's false. I mean, I could give other examples. So it's just, I think that Traditionis Custodes will fall apart in the next pontificate, or possibly the pontificate after that. And the reason it will fall apart is because it's unrealistic and it's unpastoral. And what I mean by that is the church in the modern West is suffering. It's suffering attrition. It's suffering hemorrhaging at an alarming rate. The practice of the faith is going down in every statistically measurable respect, except among those Catholics who are more conservative and more traditional. There will come a time when to be Catholic will once again mean to be traditional, just as you said earlier. I really believe that that's true. And I think that that's coming sooner than we think it is, within 20, 30 years. That's what I think.
All right. So hopefully we, in this conversation and in what we do in the future and in the books you've been writing, will be participating in a type of confirmation of the tradition of the church, despite any external challenges to that. And we will
Yes.
be on the road to continuing the good fight to speak in favor of Jesus Christ, of the Logos of God, in a society that's anti-logos, anti-reason, very irrational, even as it claims to be very rational.
Mhm.
So the church will once again become a refuge for people seeking some type of sanity in a world
Exactly.
of great mental illness. So I would like to thank you for coming on, and I hope we can talk again at some future time. Do you have a final remark?
No, thank you for inviting me on. I always enjoy talking with you. You have such a wealth of experience that you can draw upon in your life and in your your contacts with people all over the world. So it's really a pleasure to talk, Robert.
Well, thanks for saying that. Very kind of you, Peter. Good luck in all your work. God bless.
Thank you.